Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Happy Easter Sunday and good morning, friends. And I am just in a very good mood. I'm still really fired up from that first YCBK gathering that we had. We got to meet 33 families from all over. Some people drove over 4 hours. One family from California that was in to visit colleges in the area. I've been texting that mom for a few years, so it was just kind of great to meet her and to meet everybody. And since then, a lot of great things have happened. I had an incredible SACAC conference, which is like admissions nirvana for people that love this work. Some great college visits, half day at North Carolina Central and at UNC Chapel Hill that were fantastic visits. And then just got to meet some more of our podcast listeners, and meeting podcast listeners fires me up. So I drove, and on the way back, I stayed for 2 days in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Got to meet a podcast listener there on my way back. And then I got to meet one from Peoria, Illinois, who came by our home, actually. They're in town visiting colleges in Metro Atlanta and other parts of Georgia. And then I had another great visit with another family that was visiting colleges in the Metro Atlanta area. This one's from New Jersey, and they treated me to do a delicious feast. I'd shout your name out here because I want to give you credit, but I got to protect your privacy. So I love meeting podcast listeners. I'm more excited now than day one doing this podcast. And I also am excited about this episode. You know, I get excited about all episodes, but some excite me more than others. The ones that excite me more are ones where I think maybe we're talking about something new we haven't covered before, or maybe an opportunity to explain something where I see a lot of confusion or misunderstandings in the counseling room, and we get a chance to address them here through the broader media. So today we're going to share a few takeaways from the conference, both from sessions, from individual conversations with leaders. There were 500 admissions professionals and 500 college counselors at this. So it was a lot of people, as well as some takeaways from college visits. So what happens with these conferences is they tag visits on. So they hit the 4 big schools in the research triangle, the 4 large schools in the triangle. I'm talking about North Carolina State, North Carolina Central, Duke, and UNC Chapel Hill. And then they also had bus trips to Elon and High Point, which are about 75 minutes away. So they had 6 scheduled visits, and it's kind of nice. You know, you sign up for them and they do all the work for you. So all of our entire team, and I'm referring to the 4 members of our podcast team that were on the trip, Lisa, Lynda, Susan, and myself, and also 4 of the 5 college counselors that work with me at School Match for You took the trip. We all took it together. That's Lynda, Lisa, and Jennifer Mandel, who you've not met because she's not on the podcast, but she is part of our counseling team. So everyone except for Marjorie, who's also a writing coach for us in Albuquerque. She's the only one on our team that works on applications that didn't take the trip. So we all visit these colleges as part of the conference, and we all had some great takeaways. So I'll share a few things from those visits. And I also want to share something that I think listeners can learn from all the decisions that have come out. So now all the schools have released decisions, and this is where we really go in and look at all the data, see what we can learn about trends, so we can come here and share it with you, and also It also helps us to build better college lists when we get to see where people got in and where they didn't get in. It helps us to know, is this school like an unlikely or a reach or a target, a possible school, or is it like a probable or a likely school? So we crunch all the data. Some schools stay consistent and some schools really start changing. You can see those trend lines. So I'm going to share some things from that. One thing that I think will be really important is something I've talked about before about how admissions works. I don't think I've been very effective at communicating it, and I think I've come up with a different way that I think might be more effective. So I'm excited to share that with you today. And then we'll transition to Lynda's excellent interview with Marjorie, the executive director of the STARS College Network. STARS is one of the most clever college acronyms I've heard of. It just stands for Small Town and Rural Students. How brilliant is that? And so if you missed part 1, I'd strongly encourage you to go back. We've been getting great feedback on part 1, but this will be part 2 of 3. But before we dive into our content for the week, a couple announcements. So I want to let you know that our 1-hour Q&A with Andy Strickler is just 2 days away. That's right. Wednesday, April 3rd, 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central, 6:30 Mountain, 5:30 Pacific. Now, if you've already signed up, you should have received your Zoom link by now via email. So please check your spam, check your regular email. If you have not received that email, you can send an email to questions@yourcollegebound and said, I never got the link, but you should have got it. I know last time nobody complained and said they never got it. And I do want to ask a favor. Unless you're driving or nursing a baby or some other thing that just allows you to not be on the screen, if you could please come off that black look where you just see your name on a black screen. And I hope you would come on with your camera. That's what I hope you would do. It's a much more engaging experience. It makes for a much better 1-hour Q&A. If you can't do that, get a photo of yourself and put the picture up. That's just better than that black screen. But as somebody who does these, I hate it when I'm looking out to a bunch of black screens with a name on it. It feels like you're talking to someone and they turn around and you're talking to their back. So that's the only thing I didn't feel went well about our first one. There was not enough people engaged, or, I'm sure they might have been, but you can't tell when you're just seeing a black screen. So it's only an hour. We do these 6 to 12 times a year. If you could come off camera, I would greatly appreciate it. And if for some reason you can't do that, at least have a photo of yourself and not a black screen. Now, it's not too late to sign up. You still can sign up, even though we sent the Zoom link out. I'm going to send another link out to any people who sign up at the last minute that will go out the day of. I might even just send it out to everybody again, just in case people missed the first one. So excited about that. Also excited to announce that we're lined our next one up. That's right. 60-minute question and answer with Karen Christoph. Now, Karen is the Assistant VP and Dean of Admission at Colorado College. She's also been on our podcast a few times. And a little bit more about Karen. So she claims both Illinois and Massachusetts as her point of origin, having spent considerable time in both. She has a bachelor's in arts in psychology, as well as a degree in economics, both from Smith College. And like Gil Villanueva and Andy Strickler, Karen also has over 30 years of experience. And like Gil Villanueva and Andy Strickler, she's also worked at 5 different institutions in multiple states. And even that she's the assistant VP and dean, like Andy, she still has a territory. She still reads files. She has Connecticut, Massachusetts, western part, where she worked for so many years, and Rhode Island as her territories. She also has international territories in Africa and China. So she's both, in the mix right now, current with what's going on, as well as in a supervisory role over the office. So that will be May 7th, 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central, 6:30 Mountain, 5:30 Pacific. And the sign-up sheet will be up by Thursday's episode, probably by Tuesday morning. I don't put it up, so it depends a little bit on the webmaster's schedule, but he's pretty quick. So I expect it to be up on Tuesday, but definitely for sure by Wednesday or by Thursday's episode. And you just go to your collegeboundkid.com events to sign up for that. Now, I'm promising you 6 to 12 of these sessions a year, as long as we get at least 50 people and some engagement. I'm going to keep lining them up. I lined another one up at the conference. I'm not going to tell you who, It'll be later. It'll be in 2024. And so I think it's a great opportunity. Once again, these admissions pros are not coming on here to peddle their college. They're coming on to take all of your questions about anything in the college admissions landscape. That does not mean you can't talk about Connecticut College to Andy on the 3rd, or to Colorado College to Karen, or to whoever we have as our guest. But one thing I can assure you, they will all be very experienced people with, lots and lots of years experience in the business. Almost always will have been at multiple schools, and they're just great communicators and great people. And, they stay in the profession because they love students and they love this work. And so this is actually fun for them, even that 8:30 at night is your own personal free time. But if they didn't love the work, they wouldn't say, sure, let's do it. All right, so let's talk about some takeaways from my college visits, the conference, and admissions results that were released this year. All right, so I have to say something about demonstrated interest. Now, it is so complex communicating demonstrated interest because on one hand, there's schools that use demonstrated interest in all kinds of ways that I think the public doesn't realize. In a lot of ways, I think people underestimate how much how much emphasis certain schools put on DI. But then there's other schools that don't look at it at all. And I'm going to share 2 stories with you to prove this. So let's start out with the school that really puts a big emphasis on it. I'm having an in-depth conversation with a senior admissions leader. Now, I'm not going to out his school, but I will tell you that there are about 100 schools that admit less than 1 in 3 applicants. And he's at one of those schools that admits less than 1 in 3 applicants. But it's not one of the ones 10%ers and less, right? But it's in the 3% of the most selective schools in the country. And we were talking about something that happened a few years ago in college admissions, and he used the word devastating. So what was it that happened that was devastating? You're talking about the pandemic stuff? You're talking about the fact that couldn't visit, they couldn't travel? No, you know what was devastating? So I got to take you back a few years, not very many years, guessing probably 4 or 5. It's since this podcast started. In the past, when you completed the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, you would list the schools 1 to 10 because you couldn't list more than 10 schools on the FAFSA. They made a change in the new simplified FAFSA where you can now do 20, but it was 10 forever. And you would list up to 10 schools. Now, what the average student did not know is that colleges were using this to figure out which students are likely to come. So the senior admissions professional said to me, I was devastated when they took that away from us. So what happened was some articles, some investigative reporting came out that showed colleges were doing this, and then there was a backlash, and then they had to change it. So now they can't tell. So what the senior leader said to me was, Mark, we would look to see if we were number 1, 2, or 3 in the FAFSA order, and that's who we would make our offers to if we wanted the student. That's such an example of the covert and clever and creative ways schools use demonstrated interests that are going on behind the scenes, and the average person has no idea. So I wanted to share that with you because there's a lot of sophisticated things going on related to demonstrated interest. And when I did admissions, I did all of that stuff because I'm trying to figure out which students are coming. I want to admit people that want to come. So I cannot be critical of it, but it flies below the surface and is the kind of thing that's not talked about a lot because, for example, let's say this admission leader broadcasted that. Well, people could do a workaround. You could go on and submit 2 or 3 schools on the FAFSA. That's all that particular leader would see. And then you could go add schools later. That's all people would do. So things like this can't be broadcast. All right. Secondly, I spent a half a day at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It was great for me to be there. I got to talk to 7 admission leaders. I got to have an in-depth conversation with one for 50 minutes. And the director of admission, who's been there 25 years, I'm going to be doing an interview with him next month. So you guys will end up hearing that on UNC Chapel Hill. But in my conversations at Chapel Hill, It could not be clearer. They don't look at demonstrated interest at all. Not at all. I mean, they're not differentiating between early action and regular. There's not bonus points because you apply early action. It's not easier admit because you apply early action. Early action is used to help them to get to file reading earlier. So they have October 15th date so it's the only possible way they can manage their caseload of almost 69,000 applications this year. And by the way, they are preparing for a world where they see 100,000 coming. I'll talk a little bit more about that, next week, because I have some more takeaways from the conference that I can't get to all of them today. So I want to sit down with you and see, because one thing I noticed from looking at the students we work with, I will see a student that I'll give you a kind of a typical profile of an out-of-state kid. Never had a grade below A- for 4 years, very rigorous curriculum, 770 SAT, like good writing, great kid. While I don't personally get to see the recs, sometimes I get to see teacher comments. All indications, really, really great kid. And decent extracurriculars. Like, pretty big fish in their own school community. I routinely see that kid denied on a regular basis. Denied. So I wanted to sit down and ask them, who's getting in your school? Like, we have one kid in out of state there, and it's one of the strongest kids I've worked with in 25 years. And we usually don't get more than one kid in out of state to this school. So I sat down and I asked them, and here's some stats they shared, first of all. Out of state, they admitted 6%. 6, so 1 out of 17. Check this out. They waitlisted 3%. 3%, 1 out of 33 kids. They denied 91% out of state. There's not another college in the country I know that denies 91%. Not one. Not MIT, not Stanford, not Harvard, not Yale. Go down the list. So they have higher denial rate than anybody in the country. But that's not the point. I've known they've been the hardest public school to get into out of state by far. There may be, an exception for a school that admits by major getting into their comp sci program or something. But UNC doesn't do that. Nobody gets admitted into a college or into a major. They don't do any of that. Everybody gets admitted into College of Arts and Sciences, everybody. So they're not looking at major at all. So as far as out-of-state schools, I knew they're the hardest because I have the data. But that's not the reason I'm bringing this up. I wanted to ask them who gets in. Who is it that you are admitting? And it was a fascinating conversation. I thought that you might find it interesting because it speaks to a common question that I'm asked by some of the most competitive applicants, which is, who actually gets into these schools? So, by the way, here's some more stats. Almost 69,000 applications, over 52,000 out of state, so 77% out of state. And you may or may not know this, but UNC is bound from their board of governors to only admit 18% out of state. It's very strict. So you got the masses, more than 3/4, applying for about 1/6 of the spots. So they gave me 4 different types of kids that make it through their process. I thought you'd find this interesting. 1, the kid with unique extracurricular impact, national, international, like extraordinary, not someone who's doing great things in their school or in the region, but at a very high level. I'm sure some kids have statewide if they have all the other things, but far-reaching extracurricular impact. That's the first. Second, unique high-level scholar. That also has the other things like the great character. And as they said to me, you're not just normally a scholar, you're normally also having impact. But this is the kid, they said, that's getting perfect test scores like in 10th grade or whatever. And you see it in their APs and in their test scores. And they didn't say it has to be 1,600. But I'm sure it's the kid with 50, 90, and 11 5s. And the teachers say this is one of the most extraordinary scholars I've ever taught. And the scholarship is just, at the top. And they have to be at the top of their school, too. They told me that. When it came to testing, they said, well, let me get back to that in a second. I'll say something about testing in a second. Third, this was very interesting. Exceptional personal qualities. We always talk about how important personal qualities are. They said exceptional personal qualities. Now, there's a perception out there that if you're not a leader, that's all they care about. They could not have been clearer. No, I'm not talking about that. It could be a lot of things. Some of the examples they gave me, extraordinary kindness, and then they said extraordinary inclusivity. And I knew exactly what they meant. It's the kind of kid that can get along with every type of kid, can pull together the rich kid and the poor kid, the black kid and the white kid, the Latino and the Asian, the Muslim and the Jew, the international and the local kid, the rural kid and the city dweller. They can pull everybody together. Exceptional inclusivity. You want to know like who gets in these places. And then the fourth thing they said was someone who overcomes extreme adversity. And then the example they gave was like the kid who's homeless for 2 years and they're still valedictorian. Well, that's overcoming extreme adversity. So I thought that you'd find that interesting, a little bit about who gets in a place like that, which is literally the hardest public school for me to get kids into. And there's a lot of competitors for that, right? It's tough getting into Berkeley out of state, and UCLA's tough out of state, and UVA's tough out of state, and Texas is tough out of state, and Georgia Tech is tough out of state. Those are the ones that come to mind to me as that would be in that conversation. You know, others are fairly tough, but not for me at that level, you know, like a Michigan. And then others have crazy hard programs like UW for comp sci, UIUC for comp sci. But I'm just talking about overall. And the University of San Diego, especially for engineering and computer science, is really tough. So something else they said I thought you'd find interesting. This thing I said I'd come back to. How do they look at testing? So I said, I'm going to ask you a question that I know you're going to hate answering it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When should a student submit and not submit? So the answer was a good one. I love it when admission officers are candid and they have detail and nuance. So they said, if you're in our middle 50%, then you should submit. Of course, it's hard because they don't break out necessarily in in-state, out-of-state, although I have seen it some places, in-state and out-of-state breakout, but it's not always readily available. But then they said something interesting. You need to be in the middle of our 50%, but you need to be the top of your school because we're looking at your school context. If you're in the middle of our 50% for us, and you're in the middle for your school, well, we're not looking for that because we're expecting you to be, you know, at the top of your school in your testing profile. And then I do want to say this in fairness because, you know, I've been pretty critical of these schools that have returned to mandatory testing. And I've been extremely critical of the fact that these schools are announcing this stuff in February and March. Well, a big decision is expected in North Carolina for the whole state. Are they going to go return to testing? And I mentioned this a few weeks ago on the podcast. So I did have 2 conversations with 2 different people. I'm not talking about the North Carolina people, other people. And they said the legislature keeps changing their mind. But what both people said, this is the latest of what they think is going to happen for North Carolina. If you have between a 2.5 and a 2.8 GPA, I think you're going to be required to submit testing. And then anything above a 2.8, they think this is going to be the first time ever that the legislature is going to let each individual school decide themselves if they're going to be test optional or not, which should be different than how North Carolina has ever worked. They always tend to go, well, you know, we're all in it together and do the same policy across the board, where Georgia requires testing for Georgia, Georgia Tech, and Georgia College, and the other 23 schools in the USG system are, well, for them, if you have a certain GPA, you can be exempt. It ranges either 3.0, 3.2, or 3.4. So then let me take this back to this conversation with the student from North Carolina. To the senior leader at North Carolina. He said, I think actually not submitting scores hurts more kids than it helps. So I said, talk to me a little bit more about that. And he said, it's just another data point. Like when we're looking at a student and it's super competitive and we don't see a score, you know, sometimes you don't give the benefit of the doubt. So it's just kind of that interesting nuance, right? Because like, to what degree is test optional really test optional? What does that mean? You know, it's very, very nuanced. I still stand by what I always say. Having good scores, you should submit them for a test optional school or non-test optional school. The next best thing is not to submit bad scores. And the worst thing is to submit low scores. And low scores at one place could be super high at another. But anyway, I thought you'd find that interesting. All right. So that's a little bit more about that. takeaway. And who gets in? Those are some of the things that make somebody pop. I also wanted to know, how hard is it to read in an environment where you're denying so many extraordinary kids? Because that's something that really is hard for some people. It was hard for me when I did it. I really feel that is one reason I flipped to the, I know it. It's one reason I flipped to the other side of the desk. Like, is one of my friends in admissions used to say, there's only so much heartbreak your heart can take when you see extraordinary kids and you can't admit them. And some admissions people I talk to, they don't have a problem with it at all. It's not that they're callous or hard-hearted. They're really compassionate. They just have the mindset, well, they're going to land at a good place anyway. They don't have to come here. That was hard for me. So I was curious how the representative I talked to felt about that. And his perspective was very interesting. He's like, I don't have a hard time denying the high flyer out of state because we are first and foremost here to serve the kids from our state. He said, what breaks all of our hearts is the kid that's had all that adversity, but we still can't take them. That's the part that's super, super hard. It's just an interesting perspective I thought I'd share. All right, let's move on to something else. I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the FAFSA debacle. So this FAFSA debacle, we did an episode or two about it before, but it's worse than I thought. And when I'm talking about the FAFSA debacle, I was primarily talking about the fact that the new simplified FAFSA has not been able to generate the SAI for students, the student aid index, way, way, way later than what they projected, making it very, very hard for financial aid professionals to produce a package. And people are seeing that's impacting less applications. And anyway, the sense that I got in talking with quite a few people is that this year feels harder for them even than the COVID year. You think that would be impossible? I mean, in COVID, goodness gracious, people can't come to you. You can't go to them. But I think the feeling was that you felt like all that was behind you now, and it's time to return to some normalcy. But it's just super, super, super hard out there. Now, what happened with the FAFSA recently goes beyond the delay in them getting out the SAI. The problem is when they got it out, it was inaccurate in a lot of instances. So you have colleges that send out packages based on inaccurate information, and then the Department of Education has to recall. And now you got to resend out somebody else something different. It's just terrible. And so I found quite a few really discouraged admission officers about it's almost like, you tell someone, I need you to climb that 5,000-foot mountain. And you're like, I've never climbed more than 1,000-foot mountain in my life. How am I going to climb a 5,000-foot mountain? And then you say, oh, that's not all. I got to put a 100-pound load of sand on your back. And then you're completely deflated. And then say, oh, sorry. It actually says 150 pounds on the bag. I thought it was 100. I got to put a 150-pound sack on your back, and you got to go up the 5,000-foot mountain. That's how I felt it was talking to a lot of admission officers that were just talking to me about how hard the job is. Part of it is the FAFSA debacle. Part of it is the war on college. I've never been to a conference where people talk so much about the war on college. The war on college is real, and these admission officers are hearing it all the time. I don't think college is worth it. Liberal indoctrination. ROI is not there. So convince me it's worth it to send my kid to your school. That wasn't questioned in the past. They're feeling that onslaught of that. Then we have the birth, dearth, enrollment cliff. If you're new to our podcast, what happened in 07, 09 during the global financial crisis, and this happens usually during any global financial crisis, is people say, I can't afford to have kids, or am I having one kid instead of three? So you have less births. And then when you project 18 years out, you have less kids going to college. So you have less kids going to college with the birth, death, enrollment cliff, war on college. Now you have this FAFSA debacle. Then you have the rising cost of college. Then you have the rise of all the badges and all the certificate programs and all the people out here that are hiring people off of badges and certificates and online options and hybrid options. And then you've got another problem where on the more selective side, the more selective schools and the flagship schools, people keep hearing about how they are harder to get in because what's happening is the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer, while the regional publics The moderately selective and less selective privates and the community colleges are struggling. The flagships, unless you're in some states that are experiencing outmigration like West Virginia, are experiencing a surge, especially if you're in a high growth area. And the selective privates are having at least a surge, or at least they're maintaining at a minimum. They're usually maintaining their applications after they spiked significantly in the 2020 cycle. And so what that's doing is that's leading more students to say, I need to have more colleges on my list. So you got more students applying to 20 colleges. I know in our company, we had way more students apply to 20 colleges than I've ever seen before. Now, what that means for you and your recruiter is that means every time you spend time with somebody, there's less of a chance you're going to get that kid. Because they're not applying to 6 or 8 now. They're applying to 16 to 24. So that's also super frustrating. And then there was one admission officer. I attended a session that she did. She was one of 3 people on a panel. All I'll say is that she's at a Florida school. I'll just say that. She said 4 different times, she was not joking. She was half joking, but not joking. You know how someone can be half joking, but not joking? She was like, you regionals, get your butts out of Florida. So remember, regionals are admission officers that live in the area and they can really work the area, right? They can meet you at Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and meet your parents and meet you a second or third time. Come out to your school and do presentations, do interviews, they can do all that. So what regionals do is they move into high growth areas where there's lots of kids. Because if you're a fisherman and you're trying to catch bass, you got to go where the bass are. So the regionals move into the high growth areas, places like the Atlantas and the Miamis and the Tampas and the Dallas and Houston and Fort Worth and San Antonio. Like they move into fast growing places, Phoenix, and they move into these markets that are experiencing a lot of growth. You got to go where the fish are if you're trying to catch fish. And then, but if that's where you are, and if you rely a lot on local students, like that makes your job harder. So the increase in the regionals. So all these things all coming together. And then on top of this, and we haven't talked about this yet, but the Department of Education is playing hardball. So they are requiring much more transparency from all of the admission officers. They're asking for 2 years of in-depth data. And a lot of people are pushing back and they're like, give us more time. And why are they doing this? Well, what the department's going to do is they're going to calculate whether graduates of certain programs can actually afford the debt payments. And they're going to compare the students at all the colleges in this country to what an average adult in their state is making who didn't go to college. And then here's the kicker. They're going to publish the results. Can you imagine trying to convince somebody to pay a lot of money if they come out with all this data that shows that compared to your competitors, people aren't making a lot more money than someone who didn't go to college? And it's even worse. They're saying some schools potentially could lose their access to federal financial aid if they fail these tests. So there's just a lot of pressure. And what I see coming out of this, by the way, is I see more colleges, especially ones that are more focused on like social sciences, humanities, visual performing arts. They're gonna start adding more programs that pay higher wages, if that's the way it's going to be. So anyway, there's just a lot of feelings of being overwhelmed. And then the last thing, takeaway, is AI. AI is all over the place and schools don't know how to handle it. Katie, who's a senior leader at Georgia Tech, she's a rock star in the admissions world. I think of her as really being one of the real pros. She's been there for 24 years. She did a presentation, so I can share what she said because it was in front of like 100 people. But she gave all their staff a test. Here's an essay written in AI, and here's one by a student. Which one is AI versus a student? She said nobody on the staff knew with confidence which one was the AI one and which one was the student. The point is, AI is getting better and better and better. ChatGPT is getting better. Other competitors are getting better. There was a lot of talk around Christoph Gutentag, who's over at Duke's office, an article he came out talking about how Duke is no longer including essays in their academic reader rating. Doesn't mean they're not reading for content, but they're not getting an academic reader rating because they know that the chances are of that just being the student's work. I mean, who's kidding who? It's either going to be a college coach or a parent that's massaged that thing. So that has created quite a buzz. A lot of schools talking about what are they going to do about that. By the way, I spent time with Guten Tag. Not a lot of time, just probably about 12 minutes. Talking to him at the conference, and I'm going to be interviewing him in mid-May, and I'm going to talk to him about this stuff. So you'll get to hear it straight from him. He's one of the best straight shooters in the country. I can't wait to hear what he has to say when we talk about this and other things. All right, lastly, I want to share something that I find is very befuddling to students and parents I work with. And I'm going to see if I can try to explain it differently than I have in the past. And what's befuddling is, why is my student getting in schools that are harder to get into and not getting into ones that have higher acceptance rates? I find this is really perplexing. And I just pulled about a dozen of those decisions just from the students that we work with. And I say we, it's a team. We have 5 on our team that all work on applications, including our writing specialist. And so this is not just me, but it's the whole team. So I'm just going to read some of the results here. And in almost every one of these cases, people were found it confounding and perplexing. So one student got into USC and Tufts and UPenn and Barnard, all in regular admission, not early. So that's all single-digit admit rates, but didn't get into UMiami. Another student is in Princeton in regular, not single choice early action. Also in Northwestern, regular, single digit admit rate. Swarthmore, single digit admit rate. Georgetown, okay, denied at USC, waitlisted at Michigan. Another student is in at Michigan, but not in at Wisconsin or CU Boulder. Another student got into Stanford, but didn't get into Tufts or Berkeley. Another student, California kid. Another student is in at NYU Tisch, but didn't get in Skidmore. One student didn't get into UF, in-state student, but got into Wake Forest, not in ED, but in regular. One student didn't get into USC or UPenn, but got into Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, was named a Davis Scholar as one of the top kids that Columbia saw in their entire applicant pool with a wink letter. So schools can send wink letters to their top kids. We call them wink letters. That's a slang name for it's like a month before everybody else, letting you know you're going to get in because you're one of the most extraordinary ones and telling them we only send this to a few people. The student also got the Robertson as one of the top 15 kids at UNC and several other cost of attendance scholarships. I won't mention them all, but did not get USC or UPenn. Okay. One student didn't get into Florida State in-state, but got into Northeastern. Another one got into Villanova for business, which is really competitive, but didn't get into Penn State University Park. Another one didn't get into Northeastern, but they did get into Georgetown, USC, and Dartmouth in regular, which had a 5-point-something admit rate. They just read an article, it was like 5-point-something%, Dartmouth in regular. One student got into Boston College, but did not get in TCU. And another one didn't get into Villanova early, but they did get into Michigan, Ann Arbor, out of state. So what's going on here? And once again, I just pulled some of the decisions. I thought it was enough to make a point. Well, I'll tell you what most people think when they hear this. They think one of two things. They think this thing is so random. It's all over the place. Who knows? You just don't know. It's just completely random. And I would argue it's not random at all. Schools admit with intentionality. Every student is admitted for a reason. It's not sort of this eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I'm trying to remember if I can think of this name we used to play. Oh, I remember it. Wang Ho. Growing up with Norm and Dave, my brother, we had this game called Wang Ho. Some of you may know it. We still use Wang Ho. Wang Ho is this random game, right? So what happens when we're trying to make a decision? Let's say we're going out to eat. And one person says, let's go to India. And someone says, no, let's go for Thai. We say, no, let's Wang Ho over it. So the way Wang Ho works is you take your fist, and your fist is clenched with the ball. And you go 1, 2, 3, Wang Ho. And you have to open your fist, or you can leave it closed, actually. Leaving it closed means 0. Or you can put up 1 finger, 2 fingers, 4 fingers, or 5. And then the other person does the same thing. And ahead of time, you agree. For Wang Ho, it's got to start with, like I used to do with Dave all the time, right? Growing up. So let's say I say, okay, before we do it, starting with me, Dave. 1, 2, 3, Wang Ho. Let's say I keep my fist closed, 0. He opens 2 fingers. So it starts with me. That would be 2 because you add up my fist and his fist 2. And you'd start with me. So I'd go 1 on me, 2 on you. Okay, Dave, you get to pick where we're going to eat. I didn't know I was going to spend 2 minutes on Wang Ho. This just popped in my head. But that's kind of random, right? Like the Indian restaurant had just as good a chance as the Thai restaurant. A lot of people think it's random like that. It's not. Very intentional. The other big reason when this happens, everybody says, yield protection. All these other schools didn't admit you because they didn't think you're coming. And yield protection definitely happens. But I actually don't think randomness or yield protection are the 2 main reasons that explain this. The second most common reason, and it's a distant second, but it is real, is that who reads your file can make a difference. So in most admission offices, 2 people read a file at the selective schools. I mean, the dualistic admission, some places have 1. Some cases, a file might get read by 3, 4, or 5 people, depending on how hard it is to decide on and what committees it goes to. But more often than not, 2 people is the most common at more selective schools. Sometimes it's 1, and if it's clear, it goes to like a dean, and they can agree on that. But, and sometimes, most cases, first reader, second reader is most common, right? So different people in an office can have different views. They're not going to be way over there different because they're guided by reader ratings and a lot of guidance as to how to rate a file. And schools have quality control methods to make sure reader ratings are fairly consistent. But at the most selective schools where everybody's extraordinary, different things can still pop to different pieces. There's still humans involved. And holistic admissions is still human admissions because humans involved. So who reads a file? It does play a role. Individual perspectives does play a role, and I would never tell you that it doesn't. But I do not believe this is the biggest reason. The biggest reason why you saw all the decisions I read is institutional priorities, IPs. I've talked about this before, but not enough. Because most of the people were surprised by these decisions, which indicates that I haven't, I'd say at least a third of the people I listed to the podcast, or at least a little bit. Some of them listen religiously, and some don't listen at all, and some listen sporadically. Some of them came to us from the podcast. Some of them we told about the podcast when they started working with us. They're usually shocked by this. That tells me I haven't talked about IPs enough. So let's talk a little bit more about IPs. What am I talking about? Well, one school might have an initiative to take more middle income kids. They might say we have too much of a barbell. We have wealthy families over here, and then we have a lot of Pell and full Pell and under-resourced kids, but we need more of a middle. Where another school might be going for more Pell or first gen, or for more full pay, or more rural kids. One school might have a new program in sports management. So they're major sensitive, and they say, oh, this kid's interested in sports management. And you get an asterisk or thumb on the scale. I mean, I can't even talk about all the IPs. I could go on forever. But even let's talk about UNC North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Well, in that same conversation, they told me their admit rate for in-state was 35%. Their wait list was almost 15. Now, I know from working with them, you still need to be really, really strong to get in as an in-state student. And contrary to public belief, they say your chances are actually better coming from the research triangle. There's a perception out there that it's harder. They said, no, there's some special initiatives that especially the former director have that are still in place that we serve our local area. And we know these schools really, really well. Now, there's some extraordinary schools in the Research Triangle. And so that makes it kind of hard because you still need to do really well in your school context. But why did you have that 3%, 6%? I'm talking about 6% admit rate, 3% wait list versus 35 and almost 15 institutional priority. Now, that's actually more than just an institution. That comes from a state. But one thing they told me, I'm like, man, 3% wait list, like that's pretty bleak. And the person said, a lot of us think it's too high. That's still about 2,000 kids we're waitlisting. We're not going to the wait list for 2,000 kids. Meanwhile, another school will have more of a different priority when it comes to how they want to handle their wait list. So the bottom line when you look at a school's selectivity is how many applications do they get for spots and what are the institutional priorities? It shouldn't be surprising that different schools who are very different, that look for different things, are going to, sometimes a less selective school is going to deny a kid and a more selective school is going to admit a kid because they have different needs of the institution. Regular listeners have heard me use the football and the orchestra example a lot, right? If I've got 7 talented violinists, I'm looking for a bassoonist, I'm going to go for the bassoonist. Even if the 8th person that walks through my door may be a more extraordinary musician overall. Ditto for athletics, right? Got 5 quarterbacks. I need some linemen, need some wide receivers, need some defensive backs, need a kicker, need a punter. So the needs of the institution are why you see these different results. Now, having said that, a school can't tell you all of their institutional priorities. If you listen carefully, they'll let you know what some of them are. Okay, we know that University of Chicago has a rural initiative because Marjorie Betley's on here talking about the 16 schools in the STARS network. Swarthmore has been very outspoken about their rural initiative for some time. I mean, some schools tell you their institutional priorities. Other schools say, hey, our goal is to get to 25% Pell. Now, they'll tell it to you on that end. They would never say, oh, our goal is to get 60% full pay or 50% full pay because that feels gauche. But there's some things they can say and there's some things they can't say. But they're not going to say, we've got a brand new sports management major and we're on the lookout to try to find students for that. You might have a rep individually say that to you in a conversation if they get really comfortable. They're not going to tend to do that at an information session. Why? Because all of a sudden they're going to have so many sports management majors, they won't know what to do. So they kind of can't. That's one reason why DI is so slippery. If they tell you every single way they track DI, a whole bunch of parents are going to start doing things the students should do, or people are going to mimic behaviors just because that's what it takes to get in, and that's what I'm going to do. So it makes it tricky. So what does that mean? It means that it's going to feel random to some extent because you don't know what all the institutional priorities are. And that's why I had a client recently said to me, Mark, people are applying to 20 schools or more, and I don't blame them. And there really wasn't a lot I could say about that. I have some students where they'll apply to 20 schools or more, and then they'll come back and they'll say, that was a mistake. The parent will. We're not doing that again. That was way too much work. Way too much work. Then I'll have other students who do it and say, I'm glad I did it. So that's why it's so hard to come up with one policy. Anyway, hopefully you found that to be helpful. I'll have a lot more things I want to share, both from the conference and things from this weekend in successive weeks. But I like to go to these conferences to bring back information for you guys so that even if you can't go, you can get some of the benefits vicariously from being there. All right, let's transition to Lynda's interview with Marjorie Betley.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 2 of Lynda's interview with Marjorie Betley, Marjorie gets into the nuts and bolts of what STARS actually does to recruit students, and she shares a lot of very creative ways that the 16 colleges in the STARS network are using. Marjorie talks about how important school profiles are to assist admission officers in accurately reading admission files from their schools. Marjorie talks about ways in which the STARS network tries to educate rural students about what the opportunities are for their students. And finally, Marjorie explains how Khan Academy and Schoolhouse can help rural students listen and enjoy.
What are some of the programs that you actually provide to these students? So you talk about recruiting, but what else do you have to help those students?
In terms of programming, I would say there are three main pillars of how we reach students. And the way that I really sum it up is we go to them, we bring them to us, and we meet them in the middle. So those three pillars, us going to them, that is to really address the fact that we, as institutions, we have not done our due diligence in visiting as many communities and schools and students as we wish we had. So I think that's big. We do consortium travel, which is a group of schools that will get together and go visit certain areas. We did, I believe, 5 or 6 trips this past year in consortium travel, and where we would go and we would meet with, I think a good example is probably our trip that we did in New Mexico. So we would go and we would visit a high school. At that high school, we have an amazing community-based organization partner, a CBO partner called the Davis New Mexico Scholarship. And they're there, they live in the community, they get to build relationships over time, but they pull together the students. So we would meet every single student at that high school, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Over the course of about 2 to 3 hours, we would do a case study with them. They would see real college applications. We would do a panel where we would answer questions, and then we would do a mini college fair. So we'd fit all of that into like 2 to 3 hours. We'd pack all of our things up, and this was probably 10 schools on this trip. Pack all of our things up, get in the vans, drive to the next one. Do the same program, pack everything up, and then in the evening we would do sessions with parents. And I remember there was one session that we did specifically with high school counselors. And I remember asking them, how many of your high schools have more than 10 colleges that visit every single year? Only about 3 hands went up out of that whole room. And they had 10 colleges in a car right there. Like we were in a van, ready to go, ready to visit. And I think that's really, it kind of illustrates how few options students get to learn about from the admissions counselors themselves. They're not getting that information or able to ask those questions if the schools don't go to them. And I think that's really important. I visit high schools in the Atlanta area. They get 200 or 300 colleges that visit every single year. Those students are getting tons of information, tons of opportunities to ask questions. And that's really, again, that's the inequity, right, of being a little more remote means it's a little harder to reach. So that's been a really great way that we've been doing that. What I like about those programs too is that it gives us an opportunity to meet with parents. So those evening programs are really open to, this is a family decision that students make. We need to have community and family buy-in, and we need them to be able to get to know us, to build relationships and build trust over time. I think that's a huge part of where the family fits into, especially us visiting them. When they see, and I've also had parents and specifically ask me, they're like, why are you here? And I've told them, I was like, well, we're here because if we were in, we were visiting Clarksville, Tennessee. And we had chosen Clarksville very specifically instead of Nashville, even though they're just like a couple hours away, because we wanted it to be more accessible for students who might be coming from somewhere else. And I asked this parent who asked me, why are you here? And I said, well, if we were in Nashville, would you have come? And he was like, no, absolutely not. So that's why we do it. That's why we go to them. And also, these are many times students who would not have the opportunity to come visit us. It is, as you know, having kind of done the college tour stuff, it's expensive. It takes time and it takes money to go visit college campuses many times. And it's not accessible for everyone. So us going to them, us bringing them to us is another way to address that accessibility question. This year, out of the 16 institutions, more than half of them are going to be offering some sort of free fly-in opportunity or a summer program or a drive-in. So again, making the opportunity to visit our campus more accessible for students and parents. And when we say fly in, those are fully funded. We cover the cost of travel to and from campus. Specifically for things like Emerging Rural Leaders, that's a good example of one of those programs. We pick them up from the airport. We provide all the transportation during their time, all of the food, everything is covered. All they need to bring is if they want to buy souvenirs or snacks, they can do that. But they have a night where they go on an architecture boat tour and they get to see downtown Chicago. They get to go see the Bean. They get to do the deep dish pizza night. We even did one where they got to make their own deep dish pizza, which was really fun. So we really, again, those programs, while actually probably the most expensive parts of our budgets, are also the most transformational. It is that opportunity to see yourself on a college campus. And for some students who maybe haven't considered college, the idea that that's something that they want to do, maybe they don't know that that's something that they want to do, it can really plant a seed of this hope, this idea of like, oh, I can do this. I am doing it. And for students who maybe have already decided like, yes, I know I'm going to do college, it helps them kind of narrow down and say, oh, this is what I like about it. This is what I don't like about this school. What it's really hard is, as institutions, we are asking kids when they apply, what do you want out of college? When they haven't done it, they don't know. So it can be really hard to ask someone, well, what do you want out of college? I like to talk about it kind of like buying a house. You're buying a house for the next 4 years, and it's really hard to, first of all, buy a house sight unseen, and second of all, just kind of if you hadn't considered buying a house, maybe you were thinking more of the apartment. Why would you upgrade? Why would you go to that? What are the benefits? What are the downsides? So I think it is just really kind of showing them that you can do this. This is what it's like. This might be a better fit for you, or this might be a better fit for you. Those are the kinds of things that I think the campus visits, those fly-in programs, summer programs, can really help students understand. The other thing that's great about those is that even though we can't bring every student from that high school to a fly-in program or a summer program, those students are then kind of going back into their hometown communities. They're going back to their high schools, and they're sharing all of the information that they learned, all the stuff they liked and didn't like. We've had students who have gone to the programs and come back, and we had these two girls who came to us from rural Illinois. They went back to their high school. They had such a good time that they went to every single homeroom class and presented a PowerPoint presentation on what they had done over their summer program. Just so that they wanted everyone to know, like, this is cool. You guys should apply next year. You guys should go visit Chicago. I think those can be really big. And that's why that's one of our biggest pillars of the programming is the travel is the first one. Bringing them to us through these residential programs is another one. The third one is meeting students in the middle with virtual programming. Mm-hmm. We can't visit every high school. We can't bring every student. So we do want this information to be accessible. The virtual programming, we offer a monthly webinar, and then we record all those webinars into a YouTube channel. We also have a Discord server, which is a great place in terms of community for students to find each other and ask more kind of like school-specific questions through there.
I love that because there is a lot of that. What has your experience been like? Because it's different being a rural student on some of those campuses. So if you can talk to somebody who's kind of been there, done that, and getting students on a campus is important regardless of if you're rural or not. So you can get that vibe. Does this feel like home? And I have seen students from small towns walk onto a college campus like that and mind blown that there are all of these things that are a possibility for them. You talked about the school counselors when you go and visit. And I know that that can be a big hurdle for some of these students. You don't know what you don't know as a student, and you don't know what you don't know sometimes as a high school counselor in some of these rural schools. They may never have worked with early decision. They don't know what restrictive early action is. What is a CSS profile? Or they may see that uh, $80,000-$90,000 sticker price and say, this school is not for you. How are you working with those high school counselors to get them some education?
Yeah, that is a huge part of the process. And I think high school counselors are also, if we can kind of create those relationships with high school counselors, that impacts so many more students over multiple years, right? As opposed to just bringing one student to our campus, which is transformational for that student. But in terms of impact, counselors are a massive part of the idea. We are launching this year. So again, this is our first full year of programming, a series of counselor tours. One will be with the New England schools, so they'll visit Brown, MIT, and Yale, and we'll have counselors also available from Colby and Columbia to answer questions and kind of share information. But they would then get the opportunity, and these are again just rural and small town high school counselors. They would get the opportunity to visit these college campuses to ask questions. We usually run a series of workshops. One is a case study. The other is really focused on high school profiles. If there was one thing that I could try and change, and I've had so many good conversations about this in terms of, can we create a legislation? Can we do this? Can we do that? But having a high school profile for every school, but especially rural schools where we are less familiar with the community, with what the school offers, with any challenges that have been faced, that goes such a long way. Because I think when we talk about like schools in New York, again, I'm going to make this kind of like that city center thing. You say Stuyvesant or you say Bronx Science, and you say these schools, like pretty much everyone has a solid understanding of what is available at that school, where it is located, what the experience is like. But when I say, Truth or Consequences, New Mexico High School, like there is no context that we really have going into that. And if we don't have a high school profile, then we don't have any additional context when we're reading a transcript and we're saying, I don't know how many honors classes are available at this high school, or dual enrollment, or AP. So what sort of curriculum is available? I don't know. Or I don't know how many students attend. I don't know how many students go to a 4-year or 2-year college from this school. I'm not entirely certain what is available to students. Because when we read applications within the context of their high school, we want to know what was available and what they took advantage of. That also helps us understand, like, we're not going to penalize a student for taking a class that doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, like that, you can't take it. But if I don't know if it does or doesn't, it makes it a much grayer, more nebulous sort of process. And the majority of rural high schools do not have high school profiles. So it is one of those many things that we have a workshop that we work on it, and then we have like really like a fill in the blank sheet. You can put in, what is your curriculum, where are you located, how many students attend, just so that we have that basic context when we're reading through a transcript of a student, to know what's going on. So yeah, that's another one. Case studies, high school profiles. And then we talk about, resources that are available. Do you want more colleges to come visit your high school? Awesome. Let's talk about things like rep visits or Calendly, or updating the high school website, or reaching out to counselors, or any number of things that can make that another piece of the puzzle more accessible. If high schools want more colleges to come visit, we can make that happen. And there are lots of tools to do that. I think you mentioned something that I think is also really important that I share a lot with high school counselors. We do a whole financial aid session. We talk about the CSS profile, which is another thing that if you are not familiar, you don't have a lot of students going to CSS profile schools, you may not have an understanding of, or what it is, or that it costs money and things like this. So CSS profile, FAFSA, and the My Intuition calculator has been one of my favorite tools, especially for counselors and families. I think that it is a much more accessible version of a net price calculator. It's not every school is on it, but it can be very, very helpful to show examples of what students would pay out of pocket based on a school's financial aid policies.
I like what you said about that school profile, because sometimes it's like a black hole. What is this school really have to offer? And I'm going to ask this because just recently Dartmouth came out and said they're going to be requiring test scores. And I've had this conversation with some families locally and in other rural areas. And they don't realize sometimes that testing that can be valuable for a student from a rural area as another data point. So if your school doesn't have that context, if they don't offer the test scores or the AP classes or the honors classes or the advanced level math, and you still take an ACT or an SAT test and you do well, that can be beneficial, because I think a lot of those high achieving rural students are undermatched. I didn't get a 1500 on the SAT. There's no way I can go to a school like that. Not realizing that you don't have to be in that tippy top category. You're going to be considered in context. And I think that some of those counselors may be saying the schools are test optional. You don't need to worry about it. Not realizing that it can be helpful. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are. And honestly, you've got MIT is one of the 16, and they require test scores.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that for rural students?
Yeah, I do agree with the idea of adding as many data points as you can, especially when you're thinking about a school that doesn't offer AP or dual enrollment, or even if they do. Honestly, I just got coffee like a couple days ago with one of my students. She's a third year now, and she's working as a mentor for our rural student and program this year. And she's fantastic. And she has graduated with her associate's degree from a small rural high school in Kansas. And I remember having conversations with her when she was applying to UChicago, and she was so disappointed that her classes probably wouldn't transfer for credit. And that is a really common response, is like, oh, but I've already done this. And I asked her, now she's in her third year, I was like, so how's it going? And she's like, well, I have to say, like, there's my dual enrollment experience did not prepare me very well for UChicago, to be perfectly honest. And I apologize for being as upset as I was that they weren't going to transfer, because there's no way that those classes were the same as the classes that I took as a first year student. And she even went further. She was like, I think I paid my community college more money than I have paid UChicago at this rate too, because I paid a lot of money for those dual enrollment classes. Students are really concerned about getting the credit, or being able to graduate early, or things like that. And I always reassure them, like, first of all, what you're taking is not going to be repetitive. I can promise you the classes that you take will not repeat what you've already taken in dual enrollment. And if they do, you take the placement test, it'll place you up or out of certain levels. If you feel like you've already mastered that topic, that's great. What it will prepare you the best you can for the rigor that you're going to be facing. So that's, I tell students all the time, they're like, well, I have dual enrollment, I have AP, or I have honors classes. I'm like, that's great. Challenge yourself, take the rigor that you have. But maybe, like you're saying, there can be other data points. There can be testing, especially if your school doesn't offer any rigorous courses. The other thing that I think is really helpful, and part of what has brought us together in terms of what we're doing for rural students, is Schoolhouse and Khan Academy have been huge resources. that was something that we piloted. Every single STAR school has an agreement to accept Schoolhouse and Khan Academy credits. So that for students whose high school doesn't offer calculus, this is our biggest sticking point that we saw when we started the research. A lot of rural high schools do not offer calculus. That's going to be a barrier to entry for MIT, for Caltech, for Columbia, for so many of these different institutions that expect you to have calculus in order to even be considered in the application process. For Caltech, you could not be considered in the application process without a full year of calculus. I think also physics and chemistry and a bunch of other things.
Exactly.
Which are available through Schoolhouse. So I think that is this partnership, and we have on our website, it's a curated curriculum designed for STAR students. It starts in 8th grade. It's a math curriculum that starts in 8th grade and runs all the way through college level calculus and statistics. And I've seen students take advantage of it. And I think that is it's a free resource. Schoolhouse itself, so Khan Academy, I think most people are probably familiar with as an online platform where you can take things like SAT prep and ACT prep, but then also you can take many different academic courses. And Schoolhouse is a kind of an, partner offshoot, I guess, of Khan Academy that is a tutoring platform. So as you go and you're taking these Khan Academy modules and courses, you can get extra help tutoring through Schoolhouse. Once you've completed your Khan Academy modules, you can actually, through Schoolhouse, show mastery of that subject by teaching it to someone else. So it's not a standardized test. It is you showing mastery. The best way to learn is to teach someone else is to teach. So they have this really wonderful model where you can show mastery through teaching someone else. You do it through a video. The video is reviewed by a board. And if they decide that you did it successfully, you show mastery of that subject. So it gets beyond kind of some of the issues that students might have with standardized testing too, if you are just not a good test taker. This is a very different format. It's a very hands-on approach to showing mastery and learning. And again, it's accepted by all 16 of the colleges and universities and STARS.
Friends, this concludes the second part of Lynda's 3-part interview with Marjorie Betley, Executive Director of the STARS College Network. We hope you join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Thursday's episode, Vince and I will be discussing what we learned from this year's admissions decisions before we discuss an article in part 2 that appeared in the New York Times entitled, Elite College Admissions Have Turned Students into Brands. For a question from a listener, Julie and I will discuss a question from Jennifer from Texas, and she wants to know, if a college has had a lot of racial incidents, who do you talk to find out what's really going on? And how do you know whether to take it off your students list or give the school credit if the administration is handling the incidents well? We'll have the final part of our interview with Lydia Dagenet on law school admissions, and we'll have the final part of Kevin Newton Spotlight on the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Friends, it's decision time now. Many schools have stuck with May 1 deadline, and some have moved to May 15th. But whether it's 4 weeks away or 6 weeks away, a decision is imminent. And I want to give you a major tip. Start reading school newspapers for any school under serious consideration. They're almost always online, and you can go back and read back copies. You can read back copies for 2 years. It's incredible what you're going to learn. Remember, that communication is not put through the marketing filter because it's intended to be for people that are already part of the community. So they're not going to hesitate to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's a great, great, great way to get to know school culture, hot topics on campus, and even school values. And remember, friends, college is a match to be made. It is not a prize to be won. Don't worry about impressing your friends. Your concern should be that the shoe you are about to put on your foot, it fits your foot and not your friend's foot. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Lynda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Lynda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.